A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
Deep inside a dry Oregon cave, archaeologists just brushed away the dirt and lifted out something that, by every rule in the textbook, has no business being here. They sent it to the lab, certain there had been a mistake. The number came back impossible. So they ran it again. New sample, new machine, new method. The same impossible number, a third time. The same answer once more.
We found camel tooth fragments, and below that we found a really pretty orange agate scraper/knife multi-tool.
Whatever they pulled from that Oregon floor is now forcing them to face a question they have spent their entire careers insisting was already settled. And the answer does not stay in Oregon. The story. We were all told, for most of the 20th century, every textbook in this country told the same tidy little story. The first humans to set foot on this continent were called the Clovis people, named after a site in New Mexico where their distinctive stone tools were first uncovered. They were skilled hunters who shaped fluted spear points, blades with a narrow groove carved down the center that made them lighter and far more lethal. The timeline was clean. It was satisfying. It was easy to memorize. These people walked across a frozen land bridge from Asia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago. They slipped south through a narrow ice-free corridor as the glaciers pulled back, and from there they spread across an empty continent in every direction. End of story. That version was printed in every textbook, repeated in documentaries, taught in classrooms for generations, and it was defended fiercely by the scientists who had built their careers on it. To question it was to question them. And then someone walked into a row of dried-out caves in south-central Oregon and started digging in the right place. The caves nobody searched. The caves are called the Paisley Caves. Researchers had known about them for decades. People had wandered through them, glanced around, and moved on. Nobody had looked closely enough. Nobody had dug deep enough into the floor where the real story was waiting. And when a team finally did, what they pulled out of the dirt was not a weapon. It was not a tool. It was not a carved bone or a painted wall. It was something nobody on the dig had ever expected to build a discovery around. Preserved human waste, dried and hardened over an unimaginable stretch of time, sitting in the cave floor exactly where a living person had left it. The dry desert air had done what no museum vault could ever do. It had preserved a fragile organic clue across the millennia, protecting it from rot, from moisture, from everything that should have erased it long ago. And locked inside those unassuming chunks of ancient material was something a stone spear point could never give a scientist: human DNA. When researchers pulled mitochondrial DNA from the samples and sequenced it, the result left no room for argument. The genetic material matched the Native American founding haplogroups known as A2 and B2. These were not the markers of some vanished mystery population. They were not the trace of a failed migration that died out and left no children. They were the direct ancestors of the modern indigenous peoples of the Americas, real ancestors of real people who live here today. People with families, with names, with bloodlines that stretch back through thousands of years and end inside a cave most of the world had never heard of. Think about what that means. A chipped rock can be argued over, and skeptics had spent decades doing exactly that. But DNA does not lie the way a rock can. It is a chemical fingerprint left behind by a living, breathing human body. There was no dismissing it as a trick of geology. Someone had been there, someone had lived there, and that someone was the ancestor of people walking the earth today. Then came the date. The technique was accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that measures the age of organic material directly, without leaning on the dirt or the objects around it. Once the results were calibrated, the remains landed at more than 14,000 years before the present, at least a full 1,000 years before the Clovis people were ever supposed to have arrived. So the Clovis people were not first. They were not even close. And here's the part nobody in the field wanted to say out loud. Paisley was not even the first crack in the story. It was just the one that finally broke the dam. The first crack. The first crack had appeared decades earlier, on the other side of the entire country. It was a sandstone rock, shelter in western Pennsylvania, sitting on the bank of a small stream a few miles upstream from the Ohio River. The hillside curved out overhead like a stone roof, sheltering the ground beneath it from rain and weather. One archaeologist later said it had all the makings of a prehistoric vacation spot, exactly the kind of place ancient travelers would have stopped to rest for the night without a second thought. In 1955, a local historian reached into a groundhog hole on the property, scooped out a handful of dirt, and came up with artifacts that had no business being there. Years later, a scientist named James Ottovazio began carefully digging into the floor of that shelter, peeling back the earth one thin layer at a time. Picture him down in that pit, brush in hand, watching the soil get older with every inch. The deeper he went, the older the evidence became. And when the radiocarbon samples came back from the lab, they suggested humans had visited that shelter as early as 16,000 to 19,000 years ago. Ottovazio published his findings and stated plainly that the Clovis first model was wrong. The backlash was brutal. Some accused him of contaminated samples. Some ignored the paper entirely, as if it had never been written. Researchers eventually gave the resistance a name. They called it Clovis primacy syndrome, and described the stubborn defense of the old timeline as outdated and futile. The grip was that strong. One survey of working archaeologists found that even years later, only about a third fully accepted his dates. Another third were unsure. The rest still rejected the findings outright. So by the time Paisley landed, the field was already fractured down the middle. Paisley simply made it impossible to keep looking away. And then, about 70 miles from Paisley, in a place almost nobody had ever heard of, the next blow was already on its way. If you find this kind of buried history as fascinating as I do, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button right now. Because what comes next is the discovery that has experienced researchers quietly questioning everything they thought they knew, and you are going to want to be here for the rest of it. The volcanic clock. About 70 miles from Paisley, outside a tiny Oregon town in Harney County, sits a place called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. A University of Oregon archaeologist had been digging there since 2011, slowly pulling obsidian flakes and stone tools out of the ground in front of the shelter wall, one quiet season at a time. Rimrock Draw was not giving up DNA. It was giving up stone tools, animal bones, and a timeline written into the earth in volcanic ash. The most important clue at the site was a thin layer of white ash buried in the soil, like a bookmark pressed between the pages of time. Scientists identified it as ash from a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. The logic of it was beautifully simple. Anything found beneath that ash had to be older, anything above it had to be younger. A natural clock baked into the ground by a volcano that erupted more than 1,000 miles away. And beneath that ash, the team began pulling out things that should not have been there. They sifted dozens of small fragments of tooth enamel out of the soil. One belonged to a western camel, a species that roamed North America during the last ice age. Another belonged to an ancient bison, a heavier, more massive ancestor of today's American buffalo. Both animals had been extinct for thousands of years, and yet here they were, buried in the same dirt, beneath the same ash. Then came the tool. In the same layer, the team uncovered a stone implement made from orange chalcedony, a glassy form of agate that catches the light. It had multiple working edges, a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a saw-toothed edge worn smooth from heavy use. The archaeologist who found it compared it to an early Swiss Army knife. The teeth along its edge were polished down from years of work. That is not the kind of wear that develops in a week or a month. It develops over a lifetime. Whoever owned it had carried it, sharpened it, resharpened it, used it, and used it again, until one day they set it down and never picked it up again. The position of that tool changed everything. It sat below the camel tooth fragments, which meant it was older than the animal remains. And those remains, once tested, turned out to be older than anyone had braced for. The lab ran the test once, then ran it again. Both results pointed to the same window. The teeth dated to roughly 18,000 years ago, or more. The archaeologist sitting with that second matching date in front of him later admitted it was a deeply frightening thing to hold. "You do not announce a number like that," he said, without something solid to back it up. But now he had two samples, two independent tests, and two identical answers. The animals had died more than 18,000 years ago, and the stone tool buried beneath their teeth meant someone had been there even earlier. These tools belong to a category scientists call the western-stemmed tradition. They have long blades, weak shoulders, and rounded bases. They look nothing like Clovis points. They were made by different hands, following different traditions, possibly arriving from a completely different part of the world. They predate the Clovis style by thousands of years. Whoever made these was not Clovis. They were something else entirely, but Oregon was only the beginning. 700 miles to the south, in a gypsum desert almost nobody had bothered to map, 61 footprints were waiting in the dust, and the people who left them were not supposed to exist. Ghost tracks in the sand. White Sands National Park is a vast field of pale gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico. In 2009, a researcher crossing the dried surface of an ancient lake bed noticed something pressed into the gypsum at his feet. Footprints, human footprints, not one or two, but dozens of them. 61 fossilized tracks left by people walking along the shore of an Ice Age lake that has long since vanished. The prints were so clear you could make out individual toes and the curve of an arch. Some were small, the size of a child's foot. Others belonged to an adult moving quickly, almost running. These were the footprints of groups, families, children, crossing a landscape that has since turned entirely to dust. Stand in that spot and you were standing exactly where they stood. A single frozen moment in time, captured in mud, dried by the sun, and buried under sediment until someone stumbled across it thousands of years later. The first attempt to date the prints came in 2021. Scientists ran radiocarbon dating on seeds found in the same sediment layers as the tracks. The results came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. And here is where it gets worse for the textbook timeline. Skeptics push back immediately, claiming the seeds could have absorbed carbon from groundwater, making them appear far older than they really were. It was a fair criticism. So the researchers tested again, this time using a completely different method. They analyzed ancient pollen from the same layers, pollen that comes directly from trees that were alive at the time and is not affected by groundwater carbon at all. The new results match the originals exactly. Between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, a later study went further still, testing organic material from wetland mud. 3 separate sources, pollen, seeds, and mud, all tested independently. All 3 landed in the same narrow window, the very height of the last ice age, when the textbooks insist this continent was empty of human beings. The footprints were found alongside the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous creatures that vanished thousands of years ago. Their footprints crossed the same ground, preserved together in the same ancient mud. For most archaeologists, that alone was a career-ending discovery, the kind of finding nobody wants to be the one to stand up and defend. But White Sands tops out around 23,000 years. And there is something else in Southern California that is so much older it makes White Sands look almost modern. It was found completely by accident, by men who were not looking for anything at all. The freeway dig. A freeway construction crew was cutting through soil when somebody hit bone. The heavy equipment stopped. The foreman walked over. What he was looking at was not a rock, and it was not a pipe. It was the curved, unmistakable shape of something that used to be alive. There was nothing special about that day. No one was searching for a lost civilization. It was a construction site like 1,000 others, the kind of place where machines tear through the earth every day without anyone wondering what sleeps underneath. That is what makes this so unsettling. It surfaced by pure accident in the path of a road, beneath the wheels of a machine. Work stopped completely. Paleontologists were called in, and what they pulled out of the ground was the partial remains of a single mastodon, an elephant-like creature that went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. But the bones were not lying there the way nature leaves them. Something had been done to them, something deliberate. And as the team brushed the dirt away, a realization settled over the people standing around that pit. They were not looking at a fossil, they were looking at a scene. The mastodon bones showed spiral fractures, a distinctive kind of breakage that only happens when a bone is still fresh. Fossilized bone does not break this way. Old bone shatters into fragments. Fresh bone twists and spirals as it cracks. Someone had broken these bones open on purpose, almost certainly to reach the rich marrow inside, a thick and nutritious food source that prehistoric people prized. And then there were the stones. Scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized rocks that simply did not belong in the soil around them. Geologists ran the numbers. The stones were far too large and too heavy to have washed there by water. Somebody had carried them in. Somebody had used them as hammerstones and anvils, striking the bone again and again. And then, for reasons no one will ever know, they had walked away and left them behind. This is the part that keeps the experts up at night. The dating method used on the bone was uranium-thorium radiometric analysis, and every single test returned the same staggering answer. The bones were around 130,000 years old. Read that number again. Not 13,000. 130,000 years. The study was published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. Its conclusion, written in the most cautious academic language the authors could find, detonated through the entire field. Some kind of human species was already in North America 130,000 years ago. Not modern humans. The existing models do not even have a name for whoever this was. The mainstream archaeological community has mostly refused to engage with the site at all. It is too radical, too hard to explain, and too damaging to the careers of the people who would have to stand up and admit they had been wrong all along. So, who were they? Who broke open a mastodon's bones in California more than 130,000 years ago, then walked away and left their hammerstones in the dirt? Nobody knows. Nobody can even guess. For a long time, the assumption was Siberia, the land bridge, one single door into the continent. But the newest evidence is pointing somewhere completely different. Somewhere across open water. Somewhere that was supposed to be impossible to reach. The ocean route. History had always claimed the first Americans walked from Asia across a land bridge. It was the only door, the only way in. The whole model rested on one quiet assumption nobody questioned. Early humans could not cross water. They were land creatures, bound to the continents. Then someone found stone tools on a Mediterranean island that has been cut off from the mainland for around 5 million years. There was no land bridge. There never had been. Anyone who set foot there had to arrive by boat, a real boat, built with purpose, crossing open sea. And those tools were tens of thousands of years old, made by human ancestors who walked the earth long before modern humans existed. The meaning was enormous. If early humans could cross the Mediterranean that long ago, they could cross other water too. The old assumption was finished, and with it, the idea that the land bridge was the only door. Then came the genetics, and this is where the whole picture bends. Researchers studying a specific mitochondrial DNA lineage traced its origin back to the northern coast of China. The data did not show one single migration into the Americas. It showed two separate journeys, made by two different groups in two very different eras. The first wave came around 26,000 years ago. These people most likely traveled by boat, hugging the coastline from China, up past Japan, and along the edge of the Pacific. They were not crossing a frozen land bridge. They were moving from one coastal camp to the next, following the food, following the tides, building small temporary settlements wherever the sea gave them enough fish, shellfish, and seabirds to survive. It was slow. It may have taken generations, but it worked. The second wave came roughly 15,000 years ago. These people took the land route across the bridge. They are the group most often tied to the Clovis-era populations that archaeologists once believed were the very first Americans. It now seems they were not first at all. They were latecomers, walking a path that others had already traveled by sea thousands of years before. And here is the part that breaks people. Similar stone tool techniques show up across China, Japan, and the Americas. The same ways of shaping stone, the same kinds of blades, the same designs of points. This is not coincidence. This is a trail, and the trail leads back across the ocean to the coast of China. What the dirt remembers. So, the neat little story we were all taught, the one that started with Columbus and then quietly rolled back to Clovis, has fallen completely apart. The first Americans were not who we thought they were. They did not arrive when we thought they did. The footprints at White Sands, the broken bones in California, the orange tool buried beneath the volcanic ash at Rimrock Draw, the DNA preserved in the Paisley Caves, all of it points to the same uncomfortable truth. The story of human beings on this continent is far older, far stranger, and far more complicated than anyone in the field wanted to admit. And the reason it took so long to surface is not really about the dirt. The evidence was there the whole time, in caves and lake beds and roadside cuts, waiting for someone to look. What held the old story together was not a lack of proof. It was people. Careers had been built on the Clovis timeline. To accept the new evidence meant admitting the foundation of an entire field had been wrong for the better part of a century. So, for decades, the dirt remembered what the experts refused to. And somewhere out there right now, in the dirt of a place nobody has thought to dig yet, the next discovery is already waiting. So, who were the people who broke open a mastodon's bones in California more than 130,000 years ago, then vanished and left only their tools behind? Drop your theory in the comments below, because the official answer from science is that nobody knows. And if this hit you the way it hit me, do me one favor. Hit that like button so more people find this. Subscribe so you do not miss the next dig. And then click the video on your screen right now, because that story is already underway. And when it surfaces, I am going to be the first to walk you through exactly what they found.